This has been the effort of decades of organizing, decades of pushing forward the idea that caste is real.
Seattle has become the first city, not only in the United States, but anywhere globally outside South Asia, to have banned discrimination on the basis of caste.
If Dalits don't have access to the general upper caste or the general South Asian community, then it's a really isolating experience. Even in schools and colleges and universities, there are Dalit students who hear, "Tum yahan bhi aa gaye," which means you guys have come here also.
If you say you're a progressive Democrat and you vote against this legislation, then that only makes you somebody who has empowered the right wing.
The reason that we need to assert our Dalit identity is because it is being attacked. There are many Dalit folks who have lived their lives for decades, feeling vulnerable, feeling that they have no recourse, they have no protection, especially in the workspaces.
We won all this because we understood how you go up against corporate landlords and big business and the billionaire class, including Jeff Bezos himself.
We don't need to rely on the tech sector's goodwill anymore, right? The law compels them, and the way it's carefully written is that you don't need to depend on what HR does or anything. It's very clear that any discrimination in employment or jobs or in hiring or promotions or wages is illegal.
It is also happening at the same moment that we are seeing this dangerous and unfortunately steady rise of Hindutva and Hindu fundamentalism and the Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party regime in India. We cannot fight against economic exploitation if we are also not fighting against oppression. You cannot have capitalism without racism. Similarly, you cannot have capitalism without sexism or caste oppression. In other words, all these different types of oppression result or originate from a society that seeks to exploit the mass of humanity. The most prominent organization that opposed this legislation is none other than the Vishwa Hindu Parishad.
Where are you going to live? If you live in a neighborhood filled with South Asians, things that remind you of back home, you will also constantly be reminded of your caste. They always ask, but what does your last name mean? If they have an ambiguous last name, they will always question. The line of questioning around caste exists.
In order to win effective enforcement of this law and of anti-discrimination laws in general, or laws that protect workers in general, workers will have to continue to build a fight back. We got over 4,000 workers in Seattle to sign this. Without that kind of working class unity, we would not have won.
Anytime there have been, affirmative action protests, Dalits have been left alone. We saw that in 2006, we saw that in the 90s. Only now we have been seeing this form of Dalit solidarity.
Hello and welcome to the News Minute. On February 21st, the Seattle city became the first city in the United States to ban caste-based discrimination by amending the city's municipal code and including caste as a class to be protected. Anti-caste activists across the world hail this as a historic victory. To talk about this, I have with me Kshama Sawant, member of the Seattle City Council, who was on the forefront of this movement in passing this legislation. Along with her is Yashica Dutt, journalist and an author, and also Raghav Kaushik, who is a tech worker who works with the Microsoft, who is also part of this coalition. Thank you so much for talking to us. So I want to begin this conversation with Kshama. So what this law means to you, basically, because activists across the world have termed it as a historic moment for anti-caste movement, not only in the United States but also elsewhere. So what it means to you?
As you are correctly saying, and as activists around the world have said, this is truly historic what we have won in Seattle, because Seattle has become the first city, not only in the United States, but anywhere globally outside South Asia, to have banned discrimination on the basis of caste. This has implications obviously for workers in Seattle, but as we have heard now from millions of people across the country and across the world, are recognizing that this could be potentially the first step to make further gains against the phenomenon of caste discrimination. And really, when we are talking about discrimination, ultimately what we're talking about is oppression on the basis of caste. And on the one hand, we have to be sober about how far we still have to go, but on the other hand, we also should not make the mistake mistake of underestimating the impact of such a victory, because we have to keep in mind, not only is this the uh, uh, first uh, first defeat on the question of caste discrimination across the world outside South Asia, it is also happening at the same moment that we are seeing this dangerous and unfortunately steady rise of Hindutva and Hindu fundamentalism and the Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party regime in India. It's in that context that this has happened. So, in other words, this should also be seen as an offensive victory against the Hindutva and Hindu fundamentalism agenda and against right populism in general, of course, because in the United States also we have to build the left and real working class solidarity against right populism and against Trumpism.
And Yashika, you have been a journalist. You have written a book about your own personal experience. So, what this law means to you, and
Yeah,
how
thank you.
happy you are that this has happened in Seattle.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you to the News Minute for organizing this important conversation. Personally, I think it means everything, right? Because when I moved to the United States in 2014, caste awareness was bare minimum. It was zero. And from then to now, it's only been about 8 to 9 years. And you see this historic law passing in Seattle, which is, it has the state of Seattle and, city of Seattle, state of Washington has 150,000 Indian Americans living there. And many of them are Dalits, even though we have data that's available that says that most of the population of Indian Americans in the United States is upper caste. There are many Dalit folks who have lived their lives for decades, feeling vulnerable, feeling that they have no recourse, they have no protection, especially in the workspaces. If you look at the immigration patterns, where are the Indian Americans employed in the United States? Mostly the answer is tech. Now, of course, Shama and I are examples on the contrary, but at the same time, a majority of the Indian American population works in tech. And if, caste is a prevalent idea, which, I've learned from my reporting for the book that I'm currently working on, the stories that I've worked on, it is extremely prevalent and common for caste discrimination and casteist bias to come in hiring practices, or when it comes to, promotions. We've seen that with the Cisco case. So finally, there is a precedent that moving forward, the courts will understand what caste discrimination means, which is extremely historic. And the tech companies that are, based in Seattle, Microsoft, Amazon, they will have to follow the local law. And that local law will impact, hopefully, worldwide, at least in the United States. So, you can't just make change in a citywide chapter. You have to implement these policies across. So it's a huge victory, like Shama just mentioned.
And Raghav, you have been in the tech industry. So how does this change the dynamics in the tech industry, and how is this intervention, according to you, very important?
Okay, let me start with the second question first, right? I think the best illustration of how significant the victory was. One of the illustrations was how emotional people were in City Hall on the day we won it. You've probably seen some of the viral videos where people were crying. Caste oppressed people how much it meant to them. They were just in tears, right? So I think it is historic. I agree with everything Kshama and Yashicka said. I would add a couple of things. I would say it is a great recognition. It's a significant recognition that caste is a global problem. The legislation represents that. The second thing it represents is that we can actually win, right? It represents the fact that we can, when we fight, we win, as Shama likes to say, right? So that's it was significant on both of these fronts. And I think also I want to remark that the ordinance is very comprehensive. We put a lot of thought into its wording. It's very comprehensive, and that goes to your first question, right? For me, the biggest takeaway from the tech sector point of view is that we don't need to rely on the tech sector's goodwill anymore, right? The law compels them, and the way it's carefully written is that you don't need to depend on what HR does or anything. It's very clear that any discrimination in employment or jobs or in hiring or promotions or wages is illegal, right? And so in that sense, it would change the dynamic in the tech sector without relying on what the tech sector on its internal logic, right? So that to me is the biggest takeaway.
Okay, Kshama, the last time when we spoke, we had a discussion about there is definitely going to be a pushback from the other side. And like we expected, there has been a controversy. Many in the US, particularly from, people who are part of the Hindu organizations, they say that this is nothing but discrimination against one particular community. You're trying to single out one particular community. How do you respond to these claims?
It's very important for us to talk about this, because we shouldn't, as activists on the left, we shouldn't make the mistake of just engaging in an echo chamber. We have to absolutely see this as a defeat against the Hindu right wing, as I was saying earlier. And you're right, there was opposition to this legislation, and it was from the Modi aligned right wing. And you saw organizations like the Hindu American Foundation and the Coalition of Hindus of North America opposing the legislation, and they did say things like this would end up this historic legislation banning caste discrimination would target certain communities. They even called it anti-Hindu, and it's patently false. And these are not the first time we've heard arguments like this from the right wing, and it's not only from South Asian based right wing or South Asian originating right wing in the United States. Every time there's been a fight to make progress on LGBTQ plus rights, for example, we hear sections of the Christian right wing saying, well, if you protect LGBTQ plus people, then it infringes on my religion. And all progressives understand that we of course support the freedom of religion, but can never be used as an excuse to abuse or discriminate against any human being. So these arguments are patently false, and we also have to call them out and ask them, would they say that the progress that has been made and the laws that have been instituted to protect women against sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace, that they somehow are anti-men? Or we heard the white supremacist and right wing saying that Black Lives Matter is somehow discriminated against white people. Obviously, the overwhelming majority of working people in the United States completely rejected these arguments, and that is why Black Lives Matter became the largest street protest movement in US history, because there was multiracial, multi-gender unity among the working class against racism, because we all desire, whether we are Black or any other color, we desire to live in a society free of racism. So it's important to note that in this fight for this ordinance banning caste discrimination, the opposition was from the Hindu right wing, and on the other side, there was overwhelming unity among not only the South Asian community, but among the working class in general. So we obviously had oppressed caste-led organizations who were fighting for this, and alongside them we had dominant caste Hindus, we had Muslims, Sikhs, and we had Socialist Alternative, my organization. And it was not a coincidence that we won this through my Socialist Council office. It is precisely because as socialists we recognize that we have to strive to build broad-based working class unity against a society that engenders this kind of oppression and discrimination, and that we, as Malcolm X said, we cannot have capitalism without racism. Similarly, you cannot have capitalism without sexism or caste oppression. In other words, all these different types of oppression result or originate from a society that seeks to exploit the mass of humanity. And in order to do that, they need to do what we call divide and conquer. And so we have to push back against those divisions. But the way we push back is by building unity among the working class, not unity with the bosses, and understanding that we cannot fight against economic exploitation if we're also not fighting against oppression. So the fight against oppression and economic exploitation has to go hand in hand. One last thing I'll mention, the most prominent organization that opposed this legislation is none other than the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which most of your viewers will know is one of the most dangerous far-right organizations that has been that is linked with the Bharatiya Janata Party and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh agenda, and is one of the three organizations that has been implicated by the Human Rights Watch in the 2002 massacre of Muslims in the Western Indian state of Gujarat.
Yashicka, I wanted to ask you about identifying yourself as a Dalit. when people go abroad, they forget about all these things. They want to be treated as equals, because there are, at least they feel that, there is no, there won't be any kind of caste discrimination here. But you have been interacting with a lot of people. What is your experience? Is this something that they experience? In a city like Seattle too?
Well, I don't live in Seattle. I live in New York, so I will not be able to say whether folks experience discrimination
Yeah,
in certain
in
places.
in places that you live, or in people you interact with.
No, absolutely. I think that it's not unrealistic to assume that folks in Seattle who work in tech spaces, when we have had many surveys who've talked about how rampant caste discrimination is in the United States. So it's not strange to assume that people face caste discrimination. And you speak about identity. I think it's important to remember that the reason that we need to assert our Dalit identity is because it is being attacked. And I've written in my book, and I've been a part of Indian journalism for a long time now. And I came out as Dalit. I was able to come out as Dalit in the United States only because I was away from the South Asian community. But I want to underline that that's not the easiest decision to make. If you're a new immigrant in this country, the only way for you to advance and progress is through networks. Immigrant networks have shored up new immigrants who have moved to the US, and that has been going on for generations. If you think about Silicon Valley and you see this huge Indian American population, you have to wonder why and how did that happen. That happened through immigrant networks, through people referring each other for jobs, through seminars preparing you how to face these corporates, how to present yourself there, how to situate yourself there. And that is a fact. So when folks who are Dalit, who come from India and who come to the United States, if they don't have access to these networks, then they obviously have no chance of succeeding in this country. Now, of course, which is not to say that you cannot make it without relying on people around you. I mean, I have not relied on the South Asian community and I'm doing okay, but it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, because ultimately, when you move to a country that is as multiracial, as multilingual, multicultural as the United States, you have to think about where you fit in. And South Asians, if you are a Dalit person, it's very hard to fit into that community. What are you going to do? Where are you going to live? If you live in a neighborhood filled with South Asians, things that remind you of back home, you will also constantly be reminded of your caste. If you go to, there is a really popular store called Patel Brothers, which is in Jackson Heights in Queens neighborhood in New York. And if you go there, it feels like being back in India. Like there is no difference. And if suppose somebody chooses to live there, then it's impossible for the question of caste to never come about. I've heard so many testimonies from people who are dominant caste, who work in tech, and who say that they always ask, but what does your last name mean? If they have an ambiguous last name, they will always question. The line of questioning around caste exists. And we know that there are instances when caste-based societies have existed and operated in the US. I was on another panel a couple of days ago, and I heard from a tech worker who said that they'd heard of Agarwal, societies, which basically only give membership to a certain particular caste. And what's happening there is that they will ask you, it's not just talking about religion. It's not just talking about community. It's talking about ways to network. It's talking about ways to be comfortable in a new country. And if Dalits don't have access to the general upper caste or the general South Asian community, then it's a really isolating experience. One of the ways people have countered that is by forming Dalit networks. And thankfully, this legislation was able to be passed because there are really powerful Ambedkarite networks. AIC is one of them who really strongly advocated for this this resolution, to become law, this ordinance to become law. And I think that shows the strength of why we need more Dalit people moving to the United States. There's already a push of more Dalit people accessing higher education in the US. But even in schools and colleges and universities, there are Dalit students who hear, "Tum yahan bhi aa gaye," which means you guys have come here also. Like you followed, as if coming to the United States is only something that, dominant caste people can do. They've been told, so you don't have merit. that you don't belong in these spaces. So it's the same kind of slurs. There is really no difference, because like Dr. Ambedkar said, if you move Indians to any part of the world, caste system is going to move along with them, paraphrasing that quote, of course. So one should not be shocked or surprised that Indians, we carry our achars and our papad in our suitcases. We also carry caste with us.
Raghav, what happens in the tech sector? Because in big companies or big tech companies, is caste an issue? That's something that needs to be dealt with, and it mandates a law to somehow try and put an end to that kind of discrimination. Because last time I asked Kshama the same question, because it doesn't happen, you know, like 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 it doesn't happen in open. Is there a way that discrimination takes place in big tech companies? Like, can you give me some examples at how it happens, and when does a person realize that he is being discriminated because of caste? Or the moment
Sure.
you express your identity, that's the time that they start targeting you, or you become a subject of harassment.
Sure. I think actually the best evidence you will get is in the public comments of this ordinance, right? There were hundreds of public comments of, I'm talking just by caste oppressed people who experienced discrimination, right? You will find plenty of examples there, and many of them were in the tech sector. Had my friends from Ambedkar International Center, Mr. Ram Kumar and Naresh, who themselves talked about the discrimination that they experienced in the tech sector. That was part of their public comments. I've seen some in Microsoft myself, right? The typical triggering point for these kinds of things is affirmative action. That's one of the triggering points. Whenever there's an announcement of affirmative action programs, you'll see a backlash. And that happened in 2006 when the Indian government announced an increase in affirmative action programs. There was a heated discussion around that in Microsoft emails, and a lot of that was really virulent, bigoted comments made by the upper caste, so-called upper caste people, right? So that was definitely there. So I have seen that phenomenon. That is, we're talking about the Seattle area, right? Microsoft, the Seattle area primarily. And we've heard of the Cisco case. That's another example in the tech sector, right? And that was also kind of example of the kind of phenomenon that plays out. There is these kinds of bigoted comments that happen during when there's affirmative action. But then in the Cisco case, there was an example of outing, right? Somebody knew John Doe from college, and they outed their caste, and that affected their career opportunities in Cisco. So that's another example of how caste plays out. So I've seen so based on the public testimonies and what I've seen myself in Microsoft and the Cisco case, yeah, I would say it's hard to say there's no evidence of it. It's pretty clear and out in the open. I also want to point out that one comment on what Yashicka said. She mentioned the example of Agrawal Association. The association that's actually in the Seattle area. That association is right here, right? So that's another big way in which caste plays out, is in these cultural aspects. Threat ceremonies are pretty common in America. You have some things like Agrawal Association. There's things called the Brahmin Samaj of North America. You can Google these, right? These are all very proudly caste-based groups, and they claim that they are trying to preserve culture and so on, but that's really just a code word for preserving caste.
But Yashika, you were talking about the Ambedkarite groups that are, uh, th- that have become like little powerful in the United States. So, how important are these movements to push something like this? Because this is something which is huge. Uh, you know, nobody expected that Seattle will see a day which will outlaw caste.
I think they're incredibly important. I think, Ambedkarite movements, and I've mentioned that in the research for my book as well, they are the ones who kept the idea of Ambedkar alive over the years. And Ambedkarite movements, we cannot isolate the ones that are happening in the US from the ones that are happening back in India. They've been extremely strong. They've been extremely, they've been powerful in their own ways. Now, of course, in the mainstream recognition, Ambedkar has always been sidelined until now, until a few years ago, when suddenly, it seems like the upper caste establishment discovered that Ambedkar exists, while, Ambedkarite folks have always pushed his importance, make sure that his work is alive and remembered and recognized. So that has existed for the long time. It's not new. And even, we heard about 2006. I think let's go back to Mandal Commission in the 90s, when there were these protests against affirmative action. That's in the background of that movement is when Ambedkarite movements became extremely strong. The ties that, between India, the United States, and globally that were created, it was around that time. And what we are seeing right now, it seems like it happened overnight, but let me tell you, this has been the effort of decades of organizing, decades of pushing forward the idea that caste is real. We know that, living in India, we understand how strong the denial around caste is. When I came out as Dalit in 2016, people said that caste doesn't exist. Before that, people said, why do you even need to talk about caste? The Hathras case, that, the judgment we just heard last week, people have actively talked about why do we need to confront caste in that issue, even when, upper caste groups like Bajrang Dal, Hindu Mahasabha, Kshatriya Mahasabha, they were coming out in the support of the rapists. So, caste has always been a reality, and in order to counter that, groups are extremely important. Organizing is extremely important, and we've seen this effort, started from many years ago, and the first impact that we saw was in Brandeis University in 2019, where caste was first added as a protected category in Brandeis University which is close to Boston in Massachusetts. So this is, I do want to remind our viewers and listeners that this has happened after many, many years of hard work and going unrecognized. And I think it's important for us to validate that. It's important for us to call that out, and also to remember that moving forward, it is Dalits and allies, and like Kshama said, working class people and solidarity that is going to carry us forward and to make this movement into a much bigger idea. Hopefully, carry it to the highest court in the United States and have caste be added to the protected category in the civil rights law.
But before that, Raghav, I want to come to you. I want to ask you, because I was looking out, for some details, and I came across an email that was sent by a person, a member who is belonging to the coalition of Hindus in North America. In fact, he said, his argument was pretty clear. He says that this is nothing but blatant singling out of minority community based on unsubstantiated claims and false data. So the data that that this entire coalition has produced to back this bill, uh, they say that this data is unsubstantiated and it's a faulty data. How do you respond to this? Because most of it is about related to tech, is what I understand.
Yeah. There's a couple of responses to it, but I think at this point, given that thanks to all of our organizing, we had dedicated public comments from January 24th till Feb 21st. If you look at it, there's a track record of public comment every week: 21st, 24th, 31st, Feb 7th, Feb 14th, Feb 21st. The best data there is listening to the public comment, right? Which is overwhelmingly in support of the ordinance, and overwhelmingly and large number of it is by caste oppressed people describing their personal story. So that's the best data there is. I don't think and people who claim that the data doesn't exist are just lying, to be blunt, right? They can go look at and I would urge all your audience to go look at the public comment, because those are all, they're public, they're archived in the City of Seattle website. You can go view them, right? And there's like hours of, if you add it all up, it's like hours of public testimony, and overwhelmingly in support of the ordinance. But the specific points that organizations that Coalition of Hindus for North America make, one is that about Equality Labs' data and Ambedkar Study Circles data, which was the main source we used in the ordinance. Um, you know, The data collected by these organizations passed the editorial published in New York Times and Washington Post. They clearly passed the editorial bar of major newspapers, right? So the idea that these data is suspect is absurd on its face. The other thing that they say is they bring up the Carnegie Endowment data study, and if you read the Carnegie Endowment study carefully, right, it does actually substantiate in some part the case for the ordinance. It talks about uh, uh, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it talks about a substantial amount of caste discrimination that is present among the people that they sampled. So I think if you read it critically, you will see that it supports the case for the ordinance, right? So if you take it all in together, I think the idea that there's no data at this point, given all the evidence we collected over the last month, is just absurd.
Okay, Yashika, passing this law is one, but enforcement is altogether another challenge. Do you think that the American enforcement agencies they have clear understanding about caste because it's a very complicated subject? To have that understanding and to enforce that law is altogether another big challenge.
Yeah, I want to answer that question, but before that, I do have something to add to your previous question about the lack of data and the fact that this is a minority harming legislation, which is laughable because if you look at it, Indian Americans in the United States are considered a model minority. This is what white supremacists have used the Indian American community as an example to denigrate Latinos and Black Americans. So this has been historically the case. So when they're talking about how this is singling out South Asians, it's laughable because the reason that we have, the laws that protect minorities, the civil rights law that was instituted was because of the efforts of Black Americans. That was because of Black folks in the United States that we even enjoy these protections. And I would argue that South Asian Americans and Indian Americans in particular have really benefited from the protections that have existed in the United States. I mean, look around. VP Kamala Harris is part Indian. The heads of tech companies from Satya Nadella, to Google, to, think about a big tech company and you'll find lots of Indians there. So you have to think and wonder, how is it that the minority community in the United States, which has been historically discriminated against, Black people are nowhere to be found and are still struggling to be heard and be visible and to have representation, but Indian Americans are everywhere after like what, 67, 50, 60 years? How did that come about? It's because of affirmative action that exists in the United States. And now these people want to lash out at the same affirmative action that allowed them to enjoy these positions of power and privilege in the first place. So that, that argument really does not make sense. It's just you enjoy the privileges, but you don't want to extend them to other people. So I think that's really important to remember when you're considering this argument that it will single out South Asians. What it will single out is Dalit people, and it will single us getting protections. And when you talk about how this law will be implemented, I would like to argue that this is the kind of backlash that we are seeing right now. One of the things that people are questioning, caste system is so dense, it's so vast, it's so complicated. How will you understand thousands of castes that exist? How will the United States government agencies, non-South Asians, how will they understand that? The point is they don't need to understand that. You don't have to understand the history of sexuality and gender. You don't have to have a master's or a PhD in those subjects to know that trans people are discriminated against. So if trans people are discriminated, gay folks are discriminated, people from LGBTQIA communities, women, if you understand that, and hopefully, I mean, the Venn diagram is pretty overlapping. If you talk about people who hate trans rights and people who hate caste suppressed protections. So it's not, you don't have to understand the history of caste. You just have to know that people are being discriminated against and they need protection. It's very simple. When somebody goes to their HR and say, I've been discriminated based on my birth order, which considers me to be unequal, and these ideas have been propagated by my senior, by folks around me, I have been, I've faced bias and prejudice. It's the job of the company, and now legally they will be forced to enact these provisions that exist. You don't need a degree in caste. You don't have to find out what 1,000 castes are. I think none of us who live in India know what all castes are. So we can't expect that same idea from Americans who are non-South Asians. So I think it's important to remember that this is about protecting people. This is about making sure that people don't face discrimination or bias. I like to give you one example. In the 90s, when folks were suffering from AIDS, the AIDS crisis was at its peak. People didn't have to understand what the disease was or the history of it or the medications being used, but they had to understand that people who had AIDS were being discriminated in the workplace, and those protections existed. This is about protecting people.
Okay, I'll take that question to Kshama. Kshama, I was just asking Yashicka that passing this law is one big challenge, one big achievement, but enforcing the law is something which is a huge challenge, because in America, there needs to be awareness, there needs to be proper understanding of what exactly caste discrimination is. So how equipped are the agencies over there to understand this? Because I was just looking at some of the documents that you had filed, in which you had also asked for materials, and you wanted to conduct outreach programs so that the enforcement happens without any hitch or glitch.
I think it's important to understand that the main enforcement mechanism is going to be continuing to build this movement. So if you look at the way the anti-discrimination law works in Seattle, the principal mechanism that it offers is what's called the private right of action, meaning if you are somebody facing discrimination, for example, in the workplace, but not just limited to workplace, as Raghav was saying, the anti-discrimination law is comprehensive. So if you're facing it in the sector of housing or in public spaces, social spaces, you can use the law to your benefit as well. But the point being that in order to enforce the law, we have to use the courts. It's a law that says if you are being subjected to discrimination, for example, on the basis of caste, say in your workplace, say you're a worker at Amazon and your dominant caste managers are subjecting you to caste-based discrimination, then this law allows you to go to court and say that, this is illegal and I demand that the courts provide me justice. But I want to be clear that this type of enforcement and just enforcement of laws in general under capitalism don't happen in a political or social vacuum. They happen to the extent that ordinary people, working people, community members who desire to live in a decent society, we keep pushing for for corporations and for powerful people to be held accountable when they commit such actions, such as allowing or committing discrimination against, say, caste-based, oppressed caste people. And so it's important for us to be clear. HR is not on your side. A lot of people think, working people, unfortunately, may think that HR is there to protect me. No, HR is not there to protect you as a worker. HR is there to give cover to the bosses of different kinds. It's not just about caste-based discrimination. It's about the way workers are treated in general under capitalism in a corporation, where the objective of the corporation is not to make your life better as a worker and to make the lives of the majority better. The objective of the corporation is to maximize profits for the billionaire shareholders and the multimillionaire executives. It's so we should not have illusions either in HR as a section of the corporation or in the bosses in general. They are not going to want to enforce this law or any law that holds them accountable. So I would say it's important for people to remember, in order to have to win, and in fact that's the word I would use, in order to win effective enforcement of this law and of anti-discrimination laws in general, or laws that protect workers in general, workers will have to continue to build a fight back. And I think it's important to understand that we would not have won this law in the first place had we not been clear about having a fighting strategy. In fact, it is, as I was saying earlier, it is not coincidental that we were able to win this historic victory that has been unheard of, and nobody thought we were going to win such a victory. But we won this not coincidentally or as an act of God. We won this because we consciously employed a fighting approach from start to finish, and that is something that that Socialist Alternative, my organization, and I absolutely insisted on, and we always insist on. That is why we have won the $15 an hour minimum wage. We won the Amazon tax in 2020, a tax that taxes big businesses like Amazon and Starbucks in order to provide millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of funds for affordable housing. We have won a series of renters' rights victories, but we have won all this because we understood how you go up against corporate landlords and big business and the billionaire class, including Jeff Bezos himself, and win. Go up against these powerful entities. How do you win? It's also important to know that in order to win this ban on caste discrimination, we also had to defeat the democratic establishment. On the city council, it's me, one socialist or Marxist, and there are 8 Democrats, and none of them were on our side. In fact, a lot of people who were watching this, and especially the activists who were fighting for this, they know what I'm talking about. There was a publicly available meeting, you can watch this on video, where these supposed progressive Democrats were repeating right-wing talking points. And we pushed back against that effectively. And part of that absolutely was what Raghav was saying, and having hundreds of the Dalit activists themselves, working people themselves, talk about their real life experience. Yashicka spoke in public comment as well. So that was a very important component of how we were able to defeat these forces against us. The other aspect was creating, as I said, working class unity. The day we announced this legislation in the press conference, my office also released a public petition, a community petition for working people. It doesn't matter whether you're South Asian or not. It doesn't matter whether you're oppressed caste or not. If you are against discrimination on the basis of caste, then you should sign this petition. So on that basis, we got over 4,000 workers in Seattle to sign this. This is not an everyday occurrence. This is a very important point to note, because without that kind of working class unity, we would not have won. And the other aspect of a fighting approach was also understanding who's on your side and who's not. It was very important for us to explain to the hundreds of activists in the movement that the Democrats are not on our side, and we are going to win if we force them to concede to a yes vote. We ultimately won a very strong vote with 6 council members, including myself, voting yes, and 1 very right-wing Democrat voting no. But the reason we won that was because we forced the so-called progressives to concede. And one of the ways we did that was by calling them out. In public comment, we said, hundreds of us said, that if you call yourself progressive, if you say you're a progressive Democrat and you vote against this legislation, then that only makes you somebody who has empowered the right wing. You can't call yourself progressive if you vote yes or no on this. So that is a very important approach, and that might sound self-evident, but it's not. For the most part, often activists and working people, because we're very well-intentioned, we want to think well of people, we arrive at this idea by thinking that, let's make the morally persuasive arguments, and then good people, the good politicians will be on our side. It doesn't work that way. It is about power structures and balance of power. And ultimately, unfortunately, even though the Democratic Party does have some differences from the Republican Party, they're not openly right-wing and openly anti-worker. At the end of the day, they're extremely, extremely reluctant to challenge the existing status quo and existing power structures. And so they have no desire to go against the Modi regime. They have no desire to have a challenge with powerful Democrats like Biden, who is making overtures towards the Modi regime itself. So, all of this is interconnected, and that's why having a fighting approach was integral to how we won. And just to give you one example of how not to go on the defensive but to go on the offensive is, as soon as we announced this legislation, the Hindu American Foundation and their allies and started accusing this legislation of being anti-Hindu and accusing me and other activists of being anti-Hindu. And one of the instincts, unfortunately, one of the instincts among some of the activists was, well, let's not allow Muslim activists to be on the forefront because they're accusing us of being anti-Hindu. Let's keep them away. That would have been the exactly wrong thing to do, because the way you fight against Hindu fundamentalists is not by disrupting the unity that you have, but instead actually emphasizing the unity that you have. In fact, this was one of the crucial components why the Democrats were forced to vote yes, because they saw that there are tens of thousands of people and across religion, across caste, the overwhelming majority of the South Asian community, not to mention workers, American workers, are saying this is the progressive thing to do, voting yes. There is no neutral ground. You either vote progressive and vote yes, or you're on the side of the right wing. Those are the only two sides you can take. And the way we made them see that was the side, those were the only two sides, was basically showing them that the only people against this are the fundamentalists and the right wing. So take your pick.
Raghav, to you, like Kshama was pointing out, HR plays a major role, in a tech organization. Like if you have any complaints or if you have, any problems, you reach out to the HR. But in this case, there is also a fear that, once you go with these complaints, you will be, there'll be exclusion, the fear of exclusion. Is that something that you are worried, because this law actually empowers a person if he is like being discriminated because of caste, because of his identity? uh, will this have further problems, or what exactly is the mechanism that needs to be adopted in a workplace, that too in a big tech company?
I mean, I think the biggest benefit of the law is that you don't need to rely on HR. That to me is the biggest benefit, right? HR, I think Shama is 100% right. I can give you some personal examples in Microsoft also, right? When people do take case of discrimination, HR's first instinct is to say, let's keep it hushed, and let's and the person who is charged with the issue may or may not be held accountable, right? Nobody talks about it. It just kind of the issue kind of they make try to make the issue go away somehow. And for me, the biggest implication of the law is that you don't need to rely on that, right? You can there is a law. It's whether the company likes it or not, they have to enforce it. So that is, I think, and if you have a culture around it of taking the law seriously and of acting on it, then it doesn't matter what HR thinks, right? You have a law to protect you, and that's, I think, what we should focus on, right? We should focus
But
on
it
public
is
action
also
around it.
about awareness. It is also about people coming out. It's also about
Yeah,
people
absolutely.
having that kind of understanding that if you are being discriminated based on your caste, then this is what you should be doing.
It's about awareness among the employees and among the working class, right? Employee awareness among HR will, maybe will follow from that. But the primary thing that we should focus on is the awareness among the employees and the people who are actually working, and to make them aware of the law, which is a very powerful tool in their hands if they face any discrimination.
And also, Raghav, what is the way forward? Do you think that what kind of impact it will have on other cities? And what about India? Like all these big tech companies, uh, can the same thing be adopted here in India as well?
Um, yeah, so other cities in the US, I think I'm very excited about the possibility that, this Seattle victory will inspire other cities across America and in the world. Like I said at the beginning, caste is a global problem, right? So we want it to inspire movements across the world, and I think we have set a template of how we can win this, and it is important to have that kind of a approach which is based on fighting and broad unity across religion, across caste lines. So that's very important, and so I think I'm very excited about that. But we'll have to fight to win those victories. And I guess the ultimate goal in this country is national level legislation, right? We would want this to become we want the caste protections to be encoded in US law, and that's how when we would get protection across the entire country. And that was the path that was happened for other issues like LGBTQ protections. That was what happened, right? When it slowly snowballed into national level protections, and we're hoping to follow a similar path for caste. About tech sector in India, I think again the main path we should take, in my view, is not rely on the tech sector but to rely on public action, right? To strengthen the laws in India around which will compel the tech sector to provide caste protections. That is the path I think we should follow, specifically for tech sector protections in India, right? But in India, obviously, there's a very strong anti-caste movement culture, right? And so I think paying attention to tech sector now, this would be one of the things that would follow from this moment, I hope.
And Yashika, what is the way forward, and what's the big learnings from this fight, this struggle?
The first learning is that it can be done. Nobody thought that we could pass that even when the ordinance came about. Now, of course, we've had many setbacks in the past. Folks might remember the California textbook case, which came about in 2015, 2016 time, where actually people who were opposing any mentions of caste in California textbooks system, and they won. They won by excluding caste, any mentions of caste, any mentions of sati and other practices that have carried on in Hinduism, and they were successfully able to remove that by arguing that kids will be bullied in class if you mention caste, that South Asian kids will be bullied and they will be called out for being casteist if we include these provisions. And that time the caste oppressed movement was not able to secure this victory. And the fact that it has happened is a huge win. Now, of course, those arguments can still be brought back, but it's just like, how do German kids deal with their Nazi history, the Nazi history of their country? They do it by education. And I think that's another ways forward. That's not a valid argument that exists. And I want to say one of the big learnings, at least in my mind, is that we have to create coalitions and solidarity across all sections. Now, of course, for the longest time, anti-caste people, Dalits in particular, have been alone in this fight. I was talking about the 90s earlier around the Mandal Commission. Anytime there have been, affirmative action protests, Dalits have been left alone. We saw that in 2006. We saw that in the 90s. Only now we have been seeing this form of Dalit solidarity. And what other people need to do is acknowledge that and really, like Kshama said, this is something I've talked about for a long time. How can you call yourself a progressive? What kind of a leftist are you if you don't support caste-based protections, if you are not anti-caste actively? So that's one of the things that we have to consider and remember. And I think one of the big takeaways also for me is the stark gap between what people think discrimination is. If you look at the pushback that we're getting from not just, by the way, Republicans. We're not just getting this pushback from right-wing so-called people. There are many people who vote Democrat, people who are so-called liberal. They support Black Lives Matter in the US, but they don't want to support caste-based protections. It's because for them, discriminating against caste is so normalized that it doesn't feel like discrimination. They think, to kya hua agar reservation ke bare mein pooch liya? What is the problem if we ask somebody about what the reservation, what college they went to, what rank they got? Because for them, that is the obvious thing to do. That's the normal, natural, typical thing to do. The fight is to make people understand that this is discrimination. When you say these things, you can't just get away with them. And we have to start at that level. I think we have to really understand what the minds of the people are and how deeply and how ignorant they are about discrimination. But of course, it's not our job to educate. What is our job is to make sure that people understand that this is wrong and this will not be acceptable any longer.
Okay, Kshama, your concluding remarks, you said that this is just the beginning. So what next?
First of all, I just wanted to really strongly agree with one of the points that both Raghav and Yashicka made, that yes, as you were correctly saying, Shabbir, it is a question of helping people understand why this law is important. And in the American setting, it is important because a lot of working people are just not familiar. Americans are just not familiar of non-South Asian background. It's also other immigrant workers who are not from South Asia who wouldn't be aware, because why would they? This is specifically something that's relevant to South Asian people of South Asian origin. So yes, there is education involved, but it's precisely what Raghav and Yashicka was saying. It is about educating working people, people who are not perpetrating discrimination, but people who will be on our side and fight alongside us if they understand what it means. So one of the really important steps we took through my office was publishing, writing and publishing a frequently asked questions, or FAQ document, which really helped educate working people. And that is how we got thousands of non-South Asian and non-oppressed caste people also on our side, because they understood what the caste system is and why they should be, why discrimination should be ended, and ultimately why struggle against different types of oppression should be linked. So, why, if you marched for Black Lives Matter, why you should also be on our side. That explanation is important. But as far as the people who are in power, and whom do I mean? I mean dominant caste bosses, the CEOs of these tech corporations, the Democratic and Republican Party. We are not in the business of educating them, in the sense that the best way of educating people who are in power, who could have brought about all kinds of social change, but who not only did not bring about progressive change, but who have been historically and in the current time an actual obstacle to be overcome to bring about progressive change. It's not about educating them. So, the morning of the vote, actually, somebody asked me, somebody who's not actually in support of the legislation asked me, how are you going to educate corporations? How will they be on your side? And my response to them was, the best way of educating corporate bosses on caste discrimination is to enforce this discrimination, hold one of the corporations accountable in court, force them to admit publicly that they were allowing caste-based discrimination to happen on a systematic basis in their corporations, even if they knew. And I'm not speaking idly. There are actual examples. Raghav, as a worker at Microsoft, has actually helped make this public, where there was all this discussion, and the bosses knew that there is that caste discrimination is rife in their corporation, but they had no interest in solving it and addressing it. Because why? Because it benefits corporate bosses to have these kinds of divisions among working people. So don't expect them to be on our side and expect that they will keep opposing you. So I think understanding what it will take to enforce itself is one of the next steps. Really understanding that the judicial system is not on your side any more than the bosses are on your side. So we will need to keep building this movement to actually hold corporations accountable in court. But that is not something that we should wait for in terms of enforcing. We should work for it now. So one of the next steps that my Socialist Council office will be taking alongside the hundreds of activists that fought for this is hosting a public hearing in the coming months, where we want to invite people to speak about their discrimination. And if you want to speak anonymously, that is totally fine. You can anonymously send us the examples of discrimination you faced. And if you fear retaliation, it is fine. You don't have to come out and speak on it, but we want to share the examples. So that is one of the concrete next steps that we will be working on. At the same time, as Raghav mentioned earlier, we want to spread the message of how we won. So we want to be hosting public meetings alongside Ambedkarite organizations in many key cities around the nation, and also in Canada, actually, in British Columbia, where we can talk about how we won this and what will we need to do in other cities in order to win there as well. And I also wanted to just send a message of gratitude to all the activists in India who've been fighting on this issue for decades, and also an appeal that in order to make our movement stronger, actually it is better for us to be interconnected across issues. Just like the farmers' movement was able to win all its three demands against the powerful Modi regime because there was such phenomenal solidarity from the labor movement, from the rank and file, not from the leadership of the trade union movement in India, but from the rank and file, insisting on having a general strike in solidarity with the farmers' movement. Exactly like that, I hope that we are able to connect the fight against caste oppression to the fight against economic exploitation as a whole.
Right. Thank you, Yashicka and Kshama and Raghav for talking to the News Minute. It was pleasure interacting with you. I hope in the coming days, more developments will happen, and we will also be tracking your movements and your journey, and we will also be reporting on that. Thank you so much for talking to the News Minute.